Hello, my name is Carson Lloyd, and today I will be talking about corporate media manipulation and a model for ending the era of American plutocracy. So, the first point that's needed for context here is that the US, contrary to popular belief, does not have democracy. A recent study from Princeton University studied over 2,000 different policy areas in the United States and determined that public perception of a policy or public needs or wants in aggregate did not actually affect what policies ended up getting passed. What does determine what policies get passed, economic and social, is how much money is behind those policies. Um, and this is contrary to democratic governance. So the United States does not have democracy, which brings me to my thesis that democracy is dead, public opinion has little to no meaningful effect on policymaking, mass media has been used as a political weapon by the financial elite to distract, divide the country, corrupt and co-opt democratic processes, and consolidate wealth and power. It is clear that massive populist movement demanding a constitutional amendment to repeal Citizens United and the breakup of the six major media conglomerates is necessary to end elitist control of the press, which is essential for maintaining free speech and fair democracy. So we need to understand how the elites co-opted democracy through mass media consolidation and, information manipulation and distribution monopoly. So the first concept that we're going to talk about here is the illusion of choice, which is that 90% of American media is owned by just six companies, and that refers to print, TV, movies, and radio, etc. And that's compared to 1983 when 50 companies controlled the same percentage, and that's lots of 2012. And so this is going to lead us into the warrants for why we need to disband and force the breakup of the six big media companies. So the first is active neglect, which is when these companies actively ignore issues that their special interests don't want being covered. So, for example, one example of this is that income inequality is not covered to the extent that it impacts that it are not is not covered to the in traditional cable news uh, in to the extent that its impacts on society warrant. For example, it kills nearly 130,000 people each year, and it's rarely discussed in corporate media in relation to things that don't actually have that big of an impact, which brings us to our next point of threat construction as a diversionary tactic. And this is consistent with the cultivation analysis theory described in the text. And cable news, an example of this is the War on Terror, when basically for 10 years, this was what was like on the forefront of all cable news channels. It was basically on replay, um, along with several other issues, natural disasters, Katrina, and in comparison to the everyday things that we face that cause the most amount of death in America, obesity, violence, drug use, lack of access to health care, income inequality, poverty, the death pales in comparison. So our media spends more time focusing on things that are easy to grab our attention than things that actually impact us every day. And this is a way that they force accountability because if something isn't covered, then it's not an important voting issue in the minds of the public. And this is led strongly into mainstream bias, which is that they use these diversionary tactics to create balkanization, which is the division of parties across clear lines. And the farther apart the parties get, the better it is for corporate interests because it's hard to find policies that work for both sides. And what ends up happening is the media colludes with special interests both on the left and the right and drives the parties farther apart. And the only people who win in the end are the large corporations who are spending massively on political campaigns. Which brings us to our next point, which is Citizens United, and this is what is allowing the massive amount of spending on campaign finance on campaign funds, which end up going to the media companies. So they have a financial incentive not to actually get this changed. And so basically, Citizens United and a series of other decisions made by the courts ended up repealing and weakening a lot of our are campaign finance laws, which prevented special interest groups and large corporations from bankrolling candidates, essentially bribing them. It's not exactly that, but close to it. So the first impact of Citizens United is false campaign speech, which is that Citizens United decision essentially extended First Amendment protections to all forms of political speech, true or not, as long as those claims are made by a third party and it's not in collusion with the campaigner. And then the second is position adoption, which is that Americans are politically disengaged and end up trusting the candidate who's most visible. And the way they're made visible is because of how much money they have. And so corporate interests bankroll a candidate, get them on TV, get them talking, and then they become deeply entrenched in the party establishment because the party establishment is going to support people who get a ton of funding. And then voters end up just voting along party lines and end up voting for parties that support corporate interests. And as a result, they're voting against their own interests. So here are my sources, but I think I've provided pretty good analysis of how money in politics and how the media plays into supporting the deterioration of American democracy and why a massive populist movement is necessary to overturn that.